freedom. As Ronald Reagan said before, freedom is a fragile thing. It is never more than one generation away from extinction. The Constitution and the Bible on which it stands is stronger than the cheap, tyrannical tactics of those who seek to destroy it. And I yield back to the gentleman, Mr. Budd, from North Carolina.
I thank my friend from Texas. You know, mob violence is not representative of our country or of this building. The American people, at least the ones that are still up watching right now, they have seen this body return to a peaceful debate. And that's the American way. So let's get back to that debate, and let's talk for a moment about Pennsylvania. For decades, absentee voting was reserved for members of the military and citizens who were medically or physically unable to get to the polls. But in 2019, Pennsylvania dramatically increased the amount of ballots that would be cast in the presidential election through expanded, no-excuse mail-in voting. On September 17th, Pennsylvania's Democrat-controlled Supreme Court violated the Constitution by extending the deadline to receive mail-in ballots. Article 2 states that legislatures, not the courts, determine the time, manner, and place of their state's elections. But Pennsylvania's High Court directed the state officials to assume that non-postmarked ballots were received on time, without any evidence that they were sent before Election Day. On October 23rd, while early voting was already underway, the state Supreme Court ruled that election officials did not have to authenticate signatures for mail-in ballots. To sum it up, Pennsylvania officials illegally did three critical things. One, they radically expanded vote by mail for virtually any reason. Two, they removed restrictions when a ballot could be sent in. And three, they removed signature verification on those very ballots. And just this week, the Pennsylvania Senate pleaded with members of this body to delay certification until the Supreme Court resolves these disputes. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania violated their own Constitution. They violated the U.S. Constitution. They opened the door for thousands of unverifiable ballots. Because they failed to guarantee the integrity of their votes, I cannot consent to accepting Pennsylvania's electoral votes.
Time has expired. Chair will receive a message.
Madam Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Madam Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate is ready to proceed in joint session with the House of Representatives.
Thank you. For purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the challenge.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes without objection.
Madam Speaker, this is a sad day for America. A day of shame. A day of ignominy. An attack on this Capitol. An attack on our country. Our words matter. Mobs, thugs, insurrectionists, domestic terrorists attacked our government with the aim of attacking our free and fair elections. Make no mistake, these terrorists came armed with false flags, armed with hate, armed with weapons, and tragically armed with lies force-fed to them by those at the highest level of government, including some from the legislative and, yes, the executive branches. Incited by the one at the highest level of government, they attacked people, property, this Capitol, this cathedral of democracy. Words matter. In his last words to our nation and to all of us here, our dear colleague John Lewis wrote last July, "Democracy is not a state, it is an act, and each generation has an obligation to preserve its institutions." Democracy is a series of acts by you and by me, by citizens, one building upon the other and another. Not acts that we have heard and seen and suffered today, words and acts to incite violence, acts that tear at the very fabric of our democracy. Yet, Madam Speaker, I have hope. We too are armed. We are armed with the facts. We are armed with the truth. We are armed with the love of our country. We are armed with our sworn oaths, and we are armed with our precious Constitution. We have faced tyranny and insurrection before. We are here tonight to herald to America and to the world. We will defend our democracy, and we will endure. When I came into work this morning as I was preparing to come to the floor, I read Tom Friedman's op-ed, which began with the words from the Gospel of Mark. For what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world but lose his soul? For what shall it profit any man? I urge my Republican colleagues to have the courage to uphold their oath, courage like that of Congresswoman Margaret Chase Smith, a lifelong Republican, and the first in
Florida, seek recognition.
To support the objection of the electoral certification of the state of Pennsylvania.
To that objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As a new representative here, I did not envision my first speech on the House floor to be this here tonight, but rather a tribute to our first responders and frontline workers who have been a shining light in an otherwise tough year for us all. After the events tonight, I am especially grateful for our men and women who put service above self, confronting lawlessness and danger while protecting this very chamber, its members, and our constitutional republic. As a member of the People's House and the wife of a first responder, thank you to our law enforcement here today. But especially after tonight's unacceptable breach of the People's House, I am furthermore resolved in the fact that we, as representatives of the people, must take a stand for every American's right to a free and fair election as guaranteed by the Constitution. Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the Constitution explicitly rests the time and manner of our elections in the hands of our state legislatures. However, state law in the 2020 election was modified or circumvented without approval of the state legislatures. These actions are in clear violation of the Constitution, specifically Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, which grants state legislatures the sole authority to establish how state presidential electors are appointed. These changes, along with other election irregularities throughout the 2020 election, require me, as a member of this body, to object to the certification of these electoral votes, just as my colleagues across the aisle have objected to every Republican presidential election over the last 20 years. Tonight, as we undertake the very serious responsibility of debating these states' electoral certifications, I want to urge my colleagues to listen earnestly and with an open mind, remembering that just 3 days ago, we swore an oath to the United States Constitution, not a political party. Our constituents are counting on us. Our country is counting on us. Our children are counting on us, and we cannot let them down. In December, 25 of my freshman colleagues and I sent you, Madam Speaker, a letter imploring you to investigate these election irregularities. And to date, we have not received a response. That brings us to today. My colleagues across the aisle have repeatedly invoked our founding father, Benjamin Franklin, who famously said, "We have a republic if we can keep it." I say, let's keep it, and it is with that sentiment in mind that I ask my colleagues to defend the power vested in this legislative branch by the U.S. Constitution and reject the certification of the electoral votes of the state in question. It is our responsibility to have courage in the face of adversity and bring integrity back to this process, and with that, I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from the great state of Texas.
From the great state of Florida. As Americans, we believe governments receive their just powers from the consent of the governed. That sacred transaction can only happen legitimately in a free and fair election. Election integrity is the very lifeblood of our unrivaled system of self-government. The law and the Constitution give Congress not only the authority, but I believe the responsibility to serve as the last check on the integrity of our presidential elections. We either believe, according to statute, that every elector was lawfully certified and regularly given, or we don't. States certainly have broad delegated powers to administer federal elections, but they still must operate within the bounds of the Constitution. Despite receiving numerous petitions and to the detriment of the country, I might add, the Supreme Court failed to answer the most important question of the 2020 election. Can entities outside of the state legislatures make election law? The plain language of Article 2 of the Constitution answers the question unequivocally, no. The decisions made today in these chambers are of the utmost consequence, and the horrible precedent that will be established if we don't act will have lasting impact on our beloved republic. This proceeding is not just about the integrity of this election, Madam Speaker. It's about ensuring the integrity of all future elections. I take no pleasure or pride in making my objection today, nor do I wish for any state elector to be disqualified. However, based on the law, the Constitution, and my conscience, I cannot support certifying votes from any state that violated the Constitution. This decision is not about loyalty to a president, Madam Speaker. It's about my fidelity to the Constitution and the oath that I swore. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I came here tonight prepared to talk about the place I represent and how well the Democratic and Republican county officials ran our election. I wanted to point out that in my home county of Allegheny County, in the place they were counting the votes, there were 31 video cameras, 31 in the same place, just showing people counting votes, every single one of them on paper with representatives from both campaigns watching. I wanted to point out to all these great lovers and supporters of the Pennsylvania legislature that it was the Republican Pennsylvania legislature that passed a Republican bill that they all voted for and supported, that set up the system under which we just ran the election, and that the reason the president lost was because he was not as popular as other Republicans in our state. He got fewer votes than all of them. I wanted to lay out all this evidence, Madam Speaker, because I thought it was a sign of respect for my colleagues, for all the Americans out there who don't know who to trust. I was raised on that. I was raised on that respect, which makes this a hard speech for me to give. Because to do this with any kind of honesty means admitting and declaring in this House that these objections don't deserve an ounce of respect. Not an ounce. A woman died out there tonight, and you're making these objections. Let's be clear about what happened in this chamber today. Invaders came in for the first time since the War of 1812. They desecrated these halls and this chamber and practically every inch of ground where we were.
I asked that those words be taken down. You may have a disagreement on matters, but
Mr. Rand, it's not timely.
decided outright.
The gentleman's name is not timely. You didn't register an appropriate time. The gentleman will proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the fact is that at the end of the day,
Yeah, look, you say that about me every single day. So
the truth hurts.
Hold your tongue. The gentleman will proceed.
It hurts. It hurts them, it hurts this country, it hurts all of us. But the fact is that the people have made this country work by not giving in. Go ahead, shout it out. Say
The gentleman is
true.
not in order. The gentleman will proceed. Gentleman will proceed.
One last thing to say, Madam Speaker, and I thank you for your patience. All people need to know, all they need to know tonight, Madam Speaker,
There'll be order in the House. There'll be order in the House. There'll be order in the House. The gentleman will clear this chamber. The gentleman will clear the chamber. proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The truth hurts. But the fact is this. We want this government to work more than they want it to fail. And after everything that's happened today, we want that more than ever. Know that, the people watching at home. We want this government to work. We will make it work. They will not make it fail. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
When is the appropriate time to ask that the words be stricken and take it down?
Exactly when the words are spoken. You are late. For what purposes does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition? Are you seeking recognition? Who seeks time to speak on the objection? Gentleman from Louisiana?
Madam Speaker, in support of the objection.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My. Let us take a deep breath, shall we? Madam Speaker, the cornerstone of the strength of our American Republic is not only the peaceful transition of power, it's the peaceful transition of a lawful power. And it is within the parameters of our oath, indeed, is our duty to inquire if we suspect that perhaps our elections have been compromised. Much has been said about what we do not know. What we do not know calls for investigation. What we do know is that in the disputed states, governors, secretaries of state, or local election commissions acted in violation of the election clause of the U.S. Constitution, wherein state legislatures are granted the sole authority to determine how presidential electors are appointed. It's that simple. State executive officials usurp the constitutionally vested authority of state legislatures within several of the sovereign states. Now, why are we involved in Congress? Because the founders gave us a narrow role. If we suspect that an election was compromised in a sovereign state, then we have a role in the seating of those electors in the county. America is not a confederacy of states. We're a union of states. We're a representative republic. Therefore, each sovereign state has a deep obligation to follow the writ of its own election law during a federal election. We would not be having this conversation if our objections were solely rested upon the elections of sovereign state governors or state senators and representatives. It's a federal election for the President and Vice President of the United States. We certainly have a role, and we should investigate and support that role. Madam Speaker, America is an anointed nation, born of imperfect men, driven by perfect intent. May we be worthy of what it is to be an American, what it is to be a representative of the American people. May I ask, may we seek the quiet whisper of God's own voice within us. And I ask my colleagues to consider supporting this objection. I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, and thank you for yielding. Before I start, something I didn't plan on saying, this is a debate, it's a discussion. Everybody has a right to an opinion. That is American. Because someone doesn't agree with your view or your ideas does not mean that they are liars. It means they have a different view, a different opinion. And I think for God's sake, as people watch this or see it or hear it, they expect more from us than that. We can disagree at a certain level, there is nothing worse than moral pomposity. You know, today was an amazing and terrible day, but one thing that we do know, ladies and gentlemen, is that our law enforcement protected lives, and they protected and preserved our democracy. I watched firsthand, as I always have, just as I do back home in South Jersey, these brave men and women put their lives on the line to defend all of us. May God bless the woman who lost her life today, and may God bless what is and will always be the greatest nation in the history of the world, the United States of America. At the core of our country's greatness is our democratic system. Pardon me?
Rule of the House, you must use your mask.
At the core of our country's greatness is our democratic system of government. Without faith in the integrity of our elections, Americans will not have faith in our democracy. The United States of America is the international embodiment of freedom and opportunity, the shining city on a hill. Free and fair elections have always been a hallmark of America's greatness. After this past presidential election, approximately 60 million Americans have serious doubts about the outcome. That is a number that we cannot ignore.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Pardon me?
The gentleman's time has expired. That gentleman, and therefore your time. For purpose of the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition.
I rise in opposition to the objection.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes without objection.
Thank you. I started this day disheartened that our colleagues were going to drag us through this cynical political charade of objecting to duly certified electoral college votes. But I was ready and eager to defend Pennsylvania's elections and the will of Pennsylvania's voters. Never did I expect to be answering calls from family and friends concerned for my safety, or to have to barricade myself in an office. But most important of all, never did I expect to see our capital overrun by armed insurrectionists intent on disrupting our government at the urging of the president. What happened here today has made me heartsick for our country, but it only strengthens my resolve to uphold the rule of law and to protect the decision of Pennsylvania's voters. Earlier this week, we raised our hands and swore an oath to bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. But today, those who are blocking the counting of electors from Pennsylvania are showing that their allegiance lies not to the Constitution or to their constituents, and many would argue not even to the Republican Party, but to their own political fortunes and the outgoing president. Pennsylvania's voters, not members of Congress, are tasked with choosing Pennsylvania's presidential electors, and particularly not congressmen from other states. The people have spoken, and Pennsylvania certified our electors. We must respect our oath here by rejecting this unfounded objection to Pennsylvania's electoral votes and not substitute Congress's judgment for that of the people of Pennsylvania. Legal challenges to elections are serious matters, and that's why there is a place to consider those challenges in courtrooms before impartial judges. And Pennsylvania's legal process has worked. The pseudo-legal arguments that are being raised by the objectors here today are not new. Over the past 2 months, the president and his allies have filed more than 20 lawsuits to challenge the Pennsylvania election. Those challenges have been rejected in federal courts, state courts, appellate courts, and the United States Supreme Court. Challenges have been rejected by judges who are registered Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and who've been appointed by Democratic and Republican presidents. And why did they lose all those cases? As Third Circuit Judge Bevis, a Trump appointee, wrote, "Free, fair elections are the lifeblood of our democracy. Charges of unfairness are serious, but calling an election unfair does not make it so. Charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here. What the court said points to an important distinction about when and how claims of election misconduct are made. It's easy to make wild claims of election fraud on cable television or Twitter, but those claims are not facts. And while